Let's do a slight pivot and let's talk a little bit about cholesterol, because this is the big bad bunny that I get asked about all the time. And I've had lots of cardiologists on the show, people who are very well versed in cholesterol, to talk about this, because there is a lot of, I want to say, outdated information on cholesterol. I mean, if someone says good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, I know we have to have a little chat. So there's that. But then there's also stuff that we don't know, right? So increasing saturated fat, let's say, and the impact that has on cardiovascular disease progression. So let's start with cholesterol. Maybe let's just, for anyone who thinks that there's a difference between good and bad cholesterol, let's have a little chat with them. Why is there no such thing as good or bad cholesterol?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that for me, so I didn't have to. I always have that. I just had this conversation with my family actually recently. They were having me look at some of their blood work, and they were talking about how their doctor had said, my good cholesterol is in this range, my bad cholesterol is in that range. The reason why we have this assumption of good and bad cholesterol is because we look at, it's mostly from epidemiological research showing that, people who have a higher risk of cardiovascular disease or who have had cardiovascular disease tend to also show high levels of LDL, which is one of those two, there's LDL and then there's HDL. So that kind of gives LDL this quote bad cholesterol connotation, and HDL has been considered the good one. But when you look at it from a physiological perspective, both of them they're functional, they're important. Like, we have to have them. That's the thing people miss. Not like you want your LDL to go to zero. You need to have LDL. They both serve a purpose. LDL, one of its functions is to help bring nutrients and repair structures to sites of damage in your body. Like if you have damage in your arterial walls, LDL is going to go to the site of the damage and it's going to help repair it. But what, and we can talk a little bit about the different cholesterol types, having that happen frequently can cause situations where now that LDL has the potential to become problematic. It can, get lodged in that area, and it can, lead to a progression towards cardiovascular disease. But, I think a lot of times we have to look at why the damage is there rather than why LDL is the problem. I think, looking at LDL as the bad cholesterol would essentially be like, I love this analogy. It's like you drive around the neighborhood and a bunch of police officers. So you just assume that there must be a lot, that the police officer, or I'm sorry, you're in a neighborhood and there's a lot of crime and there's a lot of police officers. So you think the police officers are the source of the crime. But it's like, if you wouldn't think that, it'd be like if you come home and there's firefighters at your house and your house is on fire, you're blaming the firefighters for putting out the fire at your house, right? It's like not necessarily how it would work. The firefighters are there for a reason, because there's a fire. So the bigger question as it relates to our bodies is why is there a fire there? So, looking at LDL, it's simply correlational why we look at that as being a bad cholesterol. Now, within the LDL context, there is the VLDL, which we can talk a little bit about, which is you could probably generally consider to be a bad cholesterol. Even so, that you still have to be creating.
And we should say that these are lipoproteins, which are carrying the cholesterol. So the cholesterol doesn't change. It's just it's the propensity for we'll say the purse that has the oyster in it, right? So the oyster doesn't change. It's the purse that changes, but it's whether or not the purse degrades in the presence of oxygen. So do you have a Gucci bag that you bought off Canal Street in New York, or do you have it from the actual Gucci store? That's what we should be asking, right? Is it like...
That's a great analogy.
that's for my ladies, So is it going to be something that is going to degrade easily and quickly over time? Or is it from a really great leather maker and it's been stitched well? And I don't really know much about purses, so this is where my analogy ends. But is it going to be a high quality or low quality carrier? And to your point, you can't have LDL go to zero. And actually I wrote about this in my book. There was, I think it was from Norway. There was the N was 52,000. So it was a really large study. And they looked at cognitive deficits and CVD outcomes with people with low cholesterol. So I'll find the link. I'll put it in the show notes. But for people who had low this is total cholesterol numbers, low numbers, I think it was under, LDL, not total cholesterol. It's low LDL, under, I want to say 175. they had much worse outcomes versus those who had, or it was under 195 milligrams per deciliter. Their total cholesterol under 195 milligrams per deciliter, higher risk of death than women who had cholesterol levels above that cutoff. So cholesterol is important. It is everything. It is a sterol. It makes your vitamin D. It makes all of your sex hormones. Like, we can't not have cholesterol. And I misspoke. I said it was LDL. It was actually total cholesterol because I just pulled it up here.
Yeah.
So we want to have a certain number of cholesterol, but it's the carrier that we're concerned with. And I think that where, I've had this conversation with Ethan Weiss, with Brett Scher, who his podcast will have been published by the time ours come out. And I think that the honest answer here is that it does seem that LDL in and of itself is an independent risk factor, but it's not the only risk factor, right? Exactly. There can be other things that we mitigate risk with, right? So maybe speak a little bit about, even just things like age and smoking and activity and like we've been talking about inflammation. These are all things that can, we'll say, profoundly reduce our risk of CVD development. Cardiovascular disease development.
Yeah, for sure. And when I think to talk about one, you mentioned Dr. Brett Scher. He's somebody who I would consider to be like one of the best, educators on this topic. I think Dr. Nadir Ali also is doing a lot of great stuff. Dave Feldman, just a couple of resources there for people who are a lot more educated than I am on this topic of cholesterol and keto and everything. But one of the things that I do want to touch on that I think you brought up really importantly there is I think we make a lot of kind of generalizations of the terms that we use of cholesterol, and it kind of encompasses this like everything. We just say like, oh, cholesterol is bad or high cholesterol, but there's a big difference. And I think like one thing to talk about is, the dietary cholesterol that you consume is not the cholesterol that's being measured in your body when you get your HDL and LDL measured. So then it's actually kind of an error in anatomy. They should have never called them the same things. But when you consume cholesterol in your diet, so you have eggs, which, your heart doctor will tell you not to have too many of those. You consume eggs. Those eggs get packaged, like Stephanie was saying, is that our cholesterol gets packaged into this carrier. So the carrier that takes our dietary cholesterol is called a chylomicron, or some people say chylomicron. I'm not quite sure exactly how you're supposed to say it, but the chylomicron is what's going to take that. And those actually stay in circulation for a very short period of time after you have a meal. I forget what the number is, but it's like less than an hour or something like that where those are available. So when you go in and you're getting a fasted cholesterol test done, that's not the cholesterol that you've been consuming. That's HDL and LDL, which are the carriers of cholesterol. And these molecules are actually created in the liver. So these are produced by the body. So the thing I think we always have to think about is why would the body produce something if it's bad for us and it's supposed to kill us, right? So that kind of makes you realize that like, that's not why, the body is not producing LDL to kill you. The body is producing LDL because there's a demand for LDL to do what it needs to do in the body. And the reason, so we have to look at what are the things that are causing this LDL to need to be produced in the first place. And those are things like you mentioned, aging, I think is a general factor, but lifestyle factors like smoking is going to be a big one. And our diet is a huge one too. I know one of the really cool studies I saw, it was at Low Carb Houston a few years ago. I'm trying to think who was presenting on the topic. It might've actually been, was it Ivor Cummins, I think, that maybe presented on it. He was talking about the glycocalyx, or the protective layer of our arterial walls. We have this kind of first level of protection. And he shows this study that shows after one high carb meal, that first layer of protection is completely removed for like 4 hours after you eat. So now when you consume a high carbohydrate meal, you've kind of removed this first layer of protection. Now we think about what are some of the other things that you might be consuming in conjunction with that high carbohydrate meal. Probably some pro-inflammatory foods that are now causing inflammation, that it's not really being able to be, that protective layer can't really protect against that. So now you're starting to create damage to these arterial walls. And now LDL, there's a demand for LDL to go and start to repair and fix what's going on there. And then because of that lack of protection, those lack of extra layers, and we talk within LDL, there's these different classifications of LDL. There's the VLDL, which is a lot smaller particle that is more easily able to kind of, and I forget the technical terminology, but more able to get kind of stuck into the arterial wall.
It's able to invade it easier because of its size.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So, so that's the other thing too, is that if your doctor is just looking at LDL and not looking at VLDL, then it's not really a great picture either, because if your LDL is more of those large buoyant LDL particles that are much less likely to be atherosclerotic, then that's not as big of an issue than these smaller ones. So luckily I am starting to see a little bit of a shift where more doctors are looking at VLDL than maybe 5 or 10 years ago. I was looking at some of my family members' blood results and I was pleasantly surprised that they were actually measuring that. I think that's maybe an upgrade that's happened in that area, but yeah, so there's a lot. I think we have to look at, like you said, it is a risk factor in the sense of, if you have high LDL, like there is, Dave Feldman has a lot of great research on like his lean hyper responders. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Where there's something else going on there that's a reason why maybe their levels are high, but for everybody else is experiencing high levels, there's a reason why that is high, and it's most likely it's a lifestyle factor that's causing it. So and that's why something like a statin is, if you look at the research on a statin, it's pretty, there was another study that was talked about at that conference I went to where they were breaking down a study from a pharmaceutical company that has statin, and they were showing, the data that they presented for reduced cardiovascular risk from taking a statin. And for anybody who's not familiar with how statin works, essentially it like blocks your natural production of these internal cholesterols. So now it is effective in lowering your cholesterol. But when you look at the actual outcomes, if you break down the raw data from those studies, you see that they fudge the data a little bit, and it's actually something like 1% of the population sees like a 1% decreased risk in cardiovascular events from taking a statin. And that's because, yes, they do lower cholesterol, but that's never been shown to improve anything. Just because you have lower cholesterol does not mean that you have a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. And as you highlighted in that study out of, I think you said Norway, having lower cholesterol is actually more of a problem in a lot of cases. Like it's important for our hormones, but it's also really important for our brain. So we tend to see a pretty tight correlation between people like their cholesterol levels and cases of neurodegeneration or, Alzheimer's, different conditions like that. So it's one of the most bizarre things in the health space, in my opinion, the way that we look at cholesterol, because not only are we wrong on thinking it's as dangerous as it is, we're missing how important it is. It's like it's one of the most essential nutrients that we should be, getting. And we're looking at this other type of cholesterol in our body, and we're having that tell us that we shouldn't eat dietary cholesterol, which is, like I'm saying, is super important for us. So it's very bizarre how wrong and like it's not even some of the other things I think out there that are, like the way that we test for things, like we don't test for insulin until it's like far too late. Like some of that is just based on, I think just misunderstandings of like the research, but this other stuff are like based on misunderstandings of just biochemistry, just like the core fundamentals of like how a body operates, which is just really crazy to me. So the cholesterol thing is, and it's a big thing with, because on keto, there is the potential of cholesterol to go up. If you're following keto, it may go down. Also, we see a lot of differences from person to person in that. But the big question is it actually risky for it to be moving in either direction? And that's something that I think we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah. And I think that what I've observed is that there is, because you are eating more saturated fat, that you tend to see a transient rise in total cholesterol, in LDL, even LDL particle number, which is like something that we haven't touched on, which I actually think is a far more important number to be looking at than just your LDL. And you were mentioning, kind of the VLDLs. And I think what you're referring to is more of like a pattern A and pattern B, right? So if you have like this pattern B, which is like those dense pellet-like, those BB gun pellet-like, VLDLs, the likelihood, it's just it's like a game of chance, right? Like if you have if a higher number of those, it is going to, the likelihood that is going to invade the endothelial wall is much higher than someone who has an LDL particle, who has a pattern A type of, presentation, as you were mentioning, like the big kind of fluffier, the LDL is larger in its particle size. It's less likely to invade that endothelial wall and then attract all the macrophages and the mast cells and then the plaquing and then all the things that happen. And the LDL particle number for me is, I don't think at this point we can absolve LDL as an independent risk factor for CVD. I think that it's there, but there are so many other variables. Again, context that is so important, like the smoking. Are you consuming processed foods, as you were saying? What is your exercise and your daily movement look like? What are your stress levels like? These are very, very, very important modulators for and inflammation, as we've been touching on today. These are very important modulators for not only cardiovascular disease, but cerebrovascular disease and cancer and all like the big four, and diabetes that kind of get us in the end. So I think that can you make the argument that, all things equal, like two individuals, they both exercise, they have low inflammation, everything is equal save for their LDL, is who's going to likely have the CVD? You could probably make an argument that the individual with the higher LDL is, but is he or she going to? We don't know. And I think that if you are actively engaging in some of the things that we're talking about, then you can really mitigate your risk. And I always ran into this problem in clinic when I was co-managing a patient with a medical doctor who was only looking at total cholesterol, because we'd put them on a ketogenic diet and surprise, surprise, for about 6 months, their LDL and their cholesterol, it looked terrible. But it's not a transient change in the LDL or the total cholesterol that matters. It's your lifetime exposure to it that matters. So it's not even that you can have LDL elevated for a year, but in the context of your life, a year is not a long time, right? Yeah. And what I've often found is like that 6 to 9 month mark. That's sort of the timeline where we start to see cholesterol coming back down, and then we see the kind of a better triglyceride to HDL ratio. We see all these sort of markers that you would want to see on a healthy lipid panel improve, as well as your LDL particle number, like that pattern A to pattern B, improving as well.